The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, an ocean of sand, rocks, and heat waves that danced like molten glass under the midday sun. The range was quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind rattling the makeshift targets, and then the distant hum of an approaching helicopter far on the horizon. Most men had learned early not to underestimate the desert. Its emptiness could be misleading. It tested patience, focus, and nerves in equal measure. But none of that mattered right now, not to the SEAL chief, and not to the woman crouched behind the Barrett .50, the massive rifle resting against her shoulder like an extension of her body. He had seen dozens of snipers in his career, SEALs, Marines, contractors, but none had commanded the rifle with this kind of calm. Most newcomers fumbled with the recoil, overcompensated for wind, or overthought the shot until their hands trembled. But she moved with a precision that made the chief's jaw tighten. Her fingers adjusted the scope, fine-tuned the elevation, and checked the wind gauge with an efficiency that suggested practice, yes, but practice earned under pressure. Real pressure. Not the kind you get from a range day with friends and safety officers hovering, nearby, the kind you only find in life-or-death moments. Around them, other operators lingered, some pretending to pay attention to their own drills, some openly watching her. The chief noticed subtle changes in their posture. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-sentence, and eyes narrowing with curiosity and perhaps a touch of disbelief. This woman, whose presence in the compound had been unofficial at best, was commanding attention without saying a word. That in itself was rare. "Move back a foot," he muttered under his breath, though no one but he could hear. She obeyed without hesitation, lifting the rifle, adjusting her stance, and squinting through the scope. Her breathing was controlled, measured in even rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. But it wasn't artificial. It was honed, sharpened by repetition and stress. The chief had seen this before in veterans who had lived in hot zones for years, soldiers who had learned to calm every part of themselves, even when chaos roared around them. A bead of sweat slid down her temple. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she calculated. He noticed the way her finger rested lightly on the trigger guard, ready but not tense. Then the desert seemed to hold its breath. She fired. The sound of the Barrett cracking across the range was like thunder in a canyon. The steel target at 1,500 meters shivered violently, the bullet punching through it dead center. Dust erupted behind the target, rising like smoke signals. Other operators blinked, some in disbelief. A few muttered under their breath. The chief didn't. He only narrowed his eyes, studying her face, her posture, her calm. "Nice grouping," he said finally, stepping closer, letting his words carry just enough weight to test her reaction. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes never left the scope, scanning, adjusting, re-evaluating. Finally, she exhaled, a slow, quiet breath that barely stirred the hair on her face. "Thank you," she said softly, almost indifferent. Not arrogant, not dismissive, just matter of fact. The chief's interest sharpened. He had seen thousands of shooters in his career. From rookies to decorated snipers, few carried themselves like this. Most boasted or fumbled, but she simply existed with the rifle. It was as if it had always belonged in her hands. He circled her slowly, careful not to spook her, watching every subtle movement. There was something in the way she calculated the wind drift, factoring in the mirage of heat and distant humidity. She moved through mental calculations almost imperceptibly, turning physics and probability into instinct. His curiosity became obsession in the span of a few rounds. "You've done this before," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice low enough to sound casual, but sharp enough to demand honesty. She shrugged, lifting her gaze from the target to meet his. Her eyes were dark, steady, unflinching. Overseas, she replied, voice flat, almost bored. She said no more. Overseas, he repeated, the words lingering like smoke. That could mean countless things: military service, contractors, shadow units. But something about her tone, the way she said it, hinted at experience far beyond what she was willing to disclose. The chief stepped back, studying the surrounding operators. Some were trying to hide the awe in their expressions. Some were whispering, careful not to be overheard. He had seen this reaction countless times with top-tier snipers. The unusual calm of a shooter under pressure was magnetic. It drew attention, whether intended or not. The woman adjusted the rifle for another shot, crouching lower, elbows braced. She exhaled, then squeezed the trigger again. The crack split the air, followed by the satisfying clatter of steel. Another perfect hit. Operators murmured, eyes wide. The chief's gaze lingered longer than usual, noting the precision, the timing, the sheer confidence in every movement. "Who trained you?" he asked, though he already knew there was no simple answer. "Life," she replied without hesitation, almost a whisper. Not cryptic, but definitive. That single word carried weight: stories untold, battles fought, victories and losses witnessed. She didn't need to explain herself. The rifle and her skill were testament enough. The chief leaned against the berm, folding his arms. He had trained America's finest, seen war zones most couldn't imagine, and yet something about her unsettled him. Not in danger, not in threat, but in awareness. She had history. And history, in the line of work he lived, was rarely innocent. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly on the range. Operators had begun drifting back to their drills, though they kept glances toward her. She didn't rush, didn't falter. She methodically cycled through each step, checking the rifle, adjusting, calculating, firing. The rhythm was hypnotic, relentless, precise. Each shot told a story her lips wouldn't. Finally, she set the rifle down, resting it on its bipod. Dust clung to her sleeves. Sweat darkened the fabric at her temples. The chief stepped closer. "You've got an edge," he said carefully. He meant more than marksmanship. He meant the quiet intensity, the control, the unspoken knowledge that came from surviving things most wouldn't. Her lips pressed together, a faint smile tugging at the corner, almost imperceptible. "I do what I have to," she said. "No more, no less." The chief exhaled slowly, feeling that rare mix of respect and curiosity. She was more than a shooter. She was a professional shaped by realities he could only guess at. And for some reason, that unnerved him slightly. Around them, the desert stretched endlessly, echoing with silence. The targets, the dust, the faint wind, all witnesses to a skill few would believe, fewer still would understand. The chief realized then, this woman's story wasn't written in manuals or medals. It was carried quietly in every precise movement, every unspoken glance, and every deadly calculation. And as he watched her leave the firing line, rifle slung over her shoulder, he knew instinctively that this encounter was only the beginning. Whatever she had done overseas, wherever she had carried that weapon before, it was far more than anyone around could comprehend. And he would be damned if he didn't find out the rest. The desert heat hung thickly in the late afternoon, golden sunlight bleaching the horizon. The SEAL chief watched her as she wiped her hands on her sleeves, careful not to smudge the dust and sweat that clung to her. She moved with deliberate calm, almost detached, as though the world around her was irrelevant. He observed silently, leaning against the back of a Humvee, scanning her posture, the rhythm of her breathing, the way her eyes never lost focus, even when she allowed herself a brief glance at the sky. He had seen killers before, trained men who had operated in war zones, but she carried a confidence that wasn't born from ego, It was forged from experience. "Contractor?" he asked finally, the words low, testing her as much as gathering information. Her eyes met his, sharp and unwavering, betraying nothing. "Sometimes," she said, a single word delivered in that same flat, detached tone. He stepped closer, letting his hands rest on his belt. "Military?" She didn't answer immediately. She picked up a small notebook from her pack, flipping it open casually, as though they weren't having this conversation. "Both," she said finally, her voice calm, almost indifferent, like stating the obvious. The chief's eyes narrowed. Operators nearby began to drift closer, curiosity overcoming discretion. They exchanged looks, subtle gestures acknowledging that something unusual had just been revealed. Ghost units, shadow operations, off-the-books assignments, these weren't stories often shared, and yet here she was, casually dropping hints like breadcrumbs. "Overseas?" The chief pushed gently, though his tone carried weight. He had learned early that people like her didn't volunteer details, and every word had to be coaxed carefully. Her gaze lifted briefly, scanning the distant horizon. "Afghanistan," she said softly, not specifying a province, not offering a story. Just a place, a country that had shaped countless soldiers and contractors, a land where life often ended or began in a single heartbeat. The chief didn't flinch. He had been there, seen the dust-choked mountains and the villages perched precariously on ridges, felt the sun scorch his skin while danger lurked in every shadow. But there was something in her tone, the way she spoke without elaboration, that hinted at experiences far darker than anything the chief had faced personally. One of the younger operators, barely out of training, leaned closer, whispering to another, "Do you know what that means?" The other shook his head, eyes wide. "Yeah, she's not just good. She's lethal." The chief remained silent, letting the whispers circulate without comment. He had learned long ago that legends were best observed before being judged. He had trained hundreds of snipers, many of whom had long resumes, medals, and commendations. But skill like hers wasn't measured on paper. It was measured by calm under fire, precision under impossible odds, and most importantly, the ability to act when hesitation could mean death. She lifted her Barrett .50 again, checking the scope, adjusting the bipod slightly, the weight of the weapon a natural extension of her body. The operators tried to act casual, but their eyes betrayed them. Even the most hardened SEALs instinctively watched her, like observing a predator in the wild. "Ever fired at that kind of distance in combat?" One of the operators finally asked, voice tight with a mixture of curiosity and awe. She exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing just enough to reveal that even she carried some weight. "Once, it worked." She didn't elaborate, didn't allow herself to be drawn into storytelling. The chief noted the pause, the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her eyes flicked to the horizon before returning to the target. She wasn't boasting. She was recalling. The chief approached cautiously, lowering his voice. "Work it or live it." Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, the desert heat seemed to shrink around them. "Oath," she said simply. Silence fell, thick as the dust swirling in the late afternoon sun. The chief understood then that she wasn't a rookie hiding behind training, nor a contractor inflating her resume. She carried history, a silent record of long-range shots, high-stakes decisions, and operations so secret that even his own network of contacts wouldn't verify them. The weight of that knowledge settled like a stone in his chest. "Show me," he said quietly, not as a challenge, but as a request. Her eyes flicked to him, and for the first time, a small smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. Not pride, not arrogance, but acknowledgement that he had just recognized something most men would never see. She adjusted the scope, calculating distance, wind, humidity, and mirage, all in a rhythm that seemed almost imperceptible. Operators tried to maintain focus on their own tasks, but every now and then, a rustle of clothing, a shift in stance, or a suppressed exhale betrayed their attention. They were all drawn in by the performance, by the silent mastery displayed. It was mesmerizing. 3,600 meters, she said suddenly, almost to herself, as she read the distance from her rangefinder. Her lips pressed together briefly, calculating adjustments. She didn't tell anyone that this distance was beyond the practical range for nearly every sniper on the planet, that hitting a target at that distance meant threading a bullet through physics itself wind drift, the Earth's curvature and atmospheric density all conspiring against her. The chief's pulse quickened. He had heard stories. Rumors of impossible shots, whispered among veterans in smoke-filled tents, told late at night when no one was listening. But hearing her say it aloud made the impossible tangible. The operators around them shifted nervously. Some whispered calculations, trying to rationalize what they were witnessing. Others stared, frozen, knowing that what she had just revealed wasn't a boast, it was fact. She raised the rifle, shoulder set firmly, cheek pressed to the stock. Every muscle was controlled, every nerve tuned. Her finger hovered lightly on the trigger guard, never tense, never eager. She exhaled and fired. The crack echoed across the desert like rolling thunder. Dust erupted behind the target downrange, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the subtle nods, the exchanged glances, the barely audible intake of breath. Dead center. First round. The chief felt a strange mixture of awe and unease. This wasn't just talent. This was experience, sharpened by circumstances most men could never endure. He had trained some of the best marksmen in the world, yet she made them look ordinary. She didn't seek recognition, and yet she had captured every gaze on the range. She set the rifle down carefully, adjusting her pack, and for the first time allowed herself a small breath of relief. One shot, she said softly, almost casually, though every operator around them knew the magnitude of what she had just done. The chief stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Where did you learn that shot?" Her eyes met his, unwavering and unreadable. "I had to," she said simply. Not a story, not an explanation, just necessity. He exhaled slowly, feeling the gravity of her words sink in. That single phrase carried weight, the kind of weight only those who had survived impossible odds understood. And he realized then that this encounter, this observation, was only the beginning. There was far more to her than this day, far more than even her unmatched skill. The sun dipped lower, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Shadows stretched long across the range, and the operators began to pack up, their movements slow, deliberate, as if reluctant to break the spell. The chief remained, watching her, knowing instinctively that she carried a story the world would never record. And for the first time in years, he felt the familiar stir of curiosity one that would not let him rest until he understood the full measure of her skill, her history, and the battles she had survived. She slung the Barrett over her shoulder and walked past him, dust rising in her wake. Operators turned to watch, a mix of reverence and disbelief on their faces. The chief stayed where he was, arms crossed, the desert wind brushing against his skin, mind racing with questions. One thing was certain, this woman was no ordinary sharpshooter. She was a ghost in plain sight, and he intended to follow her trail. The desert sun sank lower, casting a fiery glow across the rugged Nevada range. Shadows stretched long and distorted, shimmering over sand and rock, while the occasional gust stirred fine particles into the air. The operators had retreated slightly to prepare their own drills, but most kept covert glances toward her, as though magnetized by her calm. The SEAL chief remained close, leaning on the hood of a Humvee, his eyes fixed on her movements. There was a quiet intensity about her, a presence that demanded attention without speaking a single word. He had seen killers before, some decorated, some infamous, but she carried herself differently. She picked up her Barrett .50 again, checking the bipod, her fingers precise and methodical. Dust clung to her sleeves, sweat dampened the back of her neck, and yet she moved with an almost mechanical grace. The chief had spent years training elite snipers, watching them adjust for wind, humidity, and mirage, but no one he had ever seen carried that quiet confidence combined with instinctual precision. This was someone who had been forged in circumstances far beyond any standard range or classroom. "Tell me about it," the chief said, lowering his voice. "Not the shot, not the target. You. Where did this come from?" Her eyes flicked up briefly, dark and unreadable, then returned to the distant horizon. "Afghanistan," she said simply. The chief didn't flinch. He had been there. He knew the landscape, the jagged peaks of Kunar province, the valleys shadowed in danger, villages perched on ridges that seemed impossibly steep. He knew the sound of a Taliban command post at night, the rustle of movement under the thin glow of a crescent moon, the tension that made even the most seasoned operators hesitate. And yet, even for him, the simplicity of her words made the threat almost palpable. "Which unit?" he asked carefully, trying to gauge whether she would offer any clue. Her eyes met his briefly, and a faint, almost imperceptible tightening of her lips suggested she had been asked that question many times before. "Task Force." "Off the books," she said finally. The words hung in the air like smoke. Operators nearby leaned closer, curious despite themselves. Ghost units. Black Ops. Jobs that weren't recorded in any logbook. Missions that existed only in whispers. Most men told stories to impress, but she said nothing beyond necessity. She carried the weight of her experience quietly, and that made it all the more terrifying. "Why here? Why now?" the chief asked softly. "You could be anywhere." Her gaze drifted toward the distant hills, tracking imaginary targets that no one else could see. "Someone had to finish the mission," she said, almost dismissively. Then, after a long pause, she added, "You don't get to pick the battlefield. You just survive it." The chief felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had trained men who had faced death daily, yet there was something in her tone that suggested she had stared at it longer than anyone else he had ever known. And survived. She raised the rifle again, setting it on the bipod with ease. Her routine was hypnotic. The scope adjusted, the wind gauge read, the mental calculations executed seamlessly in a rhythm that was nearly imperceptible. Every operator within 50 meters seemed spellbound, their own drills forgotten. Even the youngest team members, fresh from Bud ES, watched with awe. "You really did this in combat?" one of them asked quietly, almost to himself. She exhaled slowly, a sound that carried weight far heavier than words. "Once," she said. "One shot. That was all I needed." The chief's pulse quickened. That single phrase told him everything. She wasn't exaggerating. She didn't embellish. That statement carried the quiet gravity of someone who had lived a story that no one else would believe if they tried. The operators exchanged uneasy glances. Only a handful could imagine what she implied, threading a bullet through impossible physics, through mountains, through wind and gravity, to strike a single target. One shot, one kill, and the mission complete. "Tell me," he said, leaning closer. "Distance. Longest shot you ever took." Her eyes didn't waver. 3,600 meters, she said. The desert seemed to still, holding its breath. 3,600 meters. A number that defied understanding. Even the best snipers rarely approached 2,500. The logistics alone were staggering. wind drift, Coriolis effect, temperature, humidity, bullet drop, all variables that conspired to make the shot nearly impossible. And yet, she had done it. The operators shifted, some skeptical, some awed. The chief remained silent, letting the weight of her words sink in. He had heard rumors of impossible kills, whispered in bars or around smoky campfires. But hearing it from someone who had executed it firsthand made the impossible terrifyingly real. "You hit him?" he asked carefully. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment her gaze pierced him. "Yes," she said softly. First round. A low murmur ran through the gathered operators. Some exhaled sharply, trying to mask their shock. Others simply stared, the magnitude of what she had just revealed settling heavily over them. She didn't elaborate, didn't offer a story of glory. She didn't brag. The weight of her words was enough. The chief studied her face, noticing the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the quiet confidence that bordered on detachment. She wasn't proud. She was focused. She was trained. She was lethal. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You make it sound easy." Her lips pressed into a thin line, almost a smirk. "Easy isn't the word," she said. "Necessary." The chief nodded slowly, realizing he was watching someone who had carried the burden of life and death more times than most soldiers would in a career. She had survived situations that would have broken most men, and she had done so silently, invisibly, without recognition. "Why tell us now?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the gathered operators. She didn't look at him. She adjusted the rifle again, checking her bipod, scanning the horizon as though measuring an invisible target. "I didn't," she said. "You asked." The chief felt a strange mix of relief and unease. She wasn't seeking validation. She wasn't looking for praise. She simply existed with a skill and history that few could comprehend. And yet, by revealing even this fragment, she had altered the dynamic of the camp. Operators no longer looked at her as an outsider or a contractor. They looked at her as someone untouchable, someone with authority written in every precise movement. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, painting the desert in blood-orange hues, she set the Barrett down carefully and slung it over her shoulder. Dust rose in her wake as she walked past the group. Operators shifted nervously, some following her with their eyes, others pretending to resume drills. The chief remained behind, arms crossed, studying her. For a long moment, the desert was silent, except for the faint rustle of wind. He realized that her presence wasn't just about the rifle or the impossible shot. It was about experience, mastery, and survival, a combination that made her dangerous and extraordinary. One of the younger operators whispered, almost in awe, "Did you hear that? 3,600 meters. Another shook his head slowly. "First round. Can you imagine?" The chief exhaled and finally spoke aloud, though his voice was quiet, thoughtful. "She's not just a sniper. She's a ghost in plain sight. And if we don't figure out her story, we'll never understand what she's capable of." She paused at the edge of the range, turned slightly, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met his. There was no boast, no arrogance, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had noticed something few others would. And then she walked away, leaving questions hanging in the desert like dust in the wind. The chief remained, leaning on the Humvee, watching the last rays of sunlight fade across the mountains. The desert held its secrets, and she had just unveiled one of the most impossible. A woman who had survived, killed, and mastered precision beyond comprehension. And now he understood the truth. The rest of her story, including how she pulled off the 3,600-meter shot, was something he would need to uncover piece by piece, and it would change everything he thought he knew about long-range marksmanship, combat, and the limits of human skill. The desert heat faded into a cooler evening, the sky streaked with pinks and purples that bled into the jagged Nevada mountains. Shadows stretched long over the range, giving the terrain a surreal, almost otherworldly appearance. The SEAL chief watched her as she carefully adjusted the Barrett .50, the rifle resting naturally against her shoulder. Even in the fading light, her presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. Every operator within sight seemed drawn to her rhythm. The meticulous adjustment of the scope, the smooth alignment with the target, the silent precision that spoke louder than words. The chief had learned early in his career to read shooters, to interpret subtle cues in body language, breathing, and focus. He could tell when a man was nervous, when a hand trembled from overconfidence, when fear threatened to break control. But she carried a calm that defied normal measurement. Her breathing was even, her movements controlled, almost hypnotic in their flow. This wasn't a skill honed at a desert range. This was a talent sharpened under life or death conditions, forged in a fire he hadn't fully seen yet. "Afghanistan," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but carried weight. "Tell me about it. The mission. The shot." She lifted her eyes briefly, locking onto his with a gaze that was both steady and unreadable. The faint light of dusk reflected in her eyes, sharp as a blade. "It was Kuhner," she said simply. "Mountains, valleys, villages. Impossible angles, impossible shots. We weren't on paper, and the risk was extreme." The chief nodded slowly, understanding more than she said. Kuhner province was notorious. Jagged peaks that sliced the sky, deep valleys that swallowed sound, villages perched like birds' nests on steep ridges. Every operation carried risk, every step outside, a compound a gamble. And she had navigated it with a precision that defied imagination. One of the younger operators, unable to hide his curiosity, ventured a question. "You really made that 3,600-meter shot?" His voice was low, almost reverent. She didn't answer immediately. She exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing as though visualizing the distant target, the cold calculation that had guided her bullet. "Yes," she said finally, her tone quiet, almost matter-of-fact. First round. One shot. One life ended. One mission complete. The chief felt a chill rise along his spine. He had trained elite marksmen, watched men operate in war zones where a single miscalculation meant death, but he had never witnessed someone articulate such precision with this calm. The distance alone defied physics. Bullet drop, Coriolis effect, wind, temperature, and humidity all played against her. And yet she had done it, and she carried the weight of that moment silently, without fanfare or pride. "You didn't miss?" the chief asked cautiously, stepping closer. Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "No," she said. "One round. Dead center. Verified." The operators around them exchanged glances, their disbelief barely masked. Some whispered calculations under their breath, trying to reconcile the impossible physics with the reality standing before them. Others simply stared, awestruck, understanding that she wasn't exaggerating. She had achieved what few could even imagine. "Why tell us this now?" one operator asked, voice low, careful not to provoke her. She didn't answer immediately. She adjusted the rifle again, scanning the horizon, eyes sharp and calculating. "You asked," she said finally, almost dismissively. "I didn't volunteer." The chief studied her closely, noting the tension in her jaw, the faint lines around her eyes, and the quiet intensity that radiated from her every movement. She wasn't boasting. She wasn't seeking recognition. She existed with the weight of her experience, carrying history in each deliberate breath and precise adjustment. He felt a mix of awe and unease. He had faced death many times, witnessed impossible feats, but she carried a calm and lethal competence that unsettled even him. The desert, now painted in deep oranges and purples, seemed to mirror the tension in the air. Even the wind held its breath, shifting only occasionally, brushing dust lightly across the sand. "Show me," he said finally, his voice low, almost a command, though not a challenge. "Not the shot, how you moved, how you calculated, how you survived." Her lips pressed together, and for the briefest moment, a shadow of acknowledgement flickered in her eyes. She adjusted the rifle, demonstrating once again the rhythm and control that had captured everyone's attention hours before. She wasn't performing. She was revealing a skill honed in conflict, precision born of necessity. She spoke quietly as she moved, almost narrating to herself. "We had limited intel, limited time, and limited options." The commander moved compounds unpredictably. Wind shifted constantly. Elevation changed with each meter. One shot was all we had, and I had to calculate every factor before squeezing the trigger. The chief nodded slowly, understanding the gravity. Operators nearby were silent, hanging on each word, realizing they were witnessing a glimpse into a world most would never know existed. A world where calculation and instinct blended seamlessly, where a single bullet could decide life or death for hundreds. She paused, scanning the range with a trained eye, and then continued. "I set up on a ridge, elevation calculated. Wind measured, bullet choice verified. Time and distance were critical. One miscalculation, one delay, and it would have failed. But the target moved within the margin of error. I waited, breathed, pulled the trigger. The rest? Confirmation." The chief's pulse quickened. He had trained men who prided themselves on sniping skill, but this was on an entirely different plane. He realized the 3,600-meter shot wasn't just skill, it was a product of survival instincts, calculation, and courage forged in fire. "Did it feel impossible?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Impossible?" she repeated. "Not in that moment. Necessity makes things possible. Fear doesn't. Calculation does. Instinct does." He exhaled slowly, recognizing the truth in her words. Survival shaped her, battle hardened her, and necessity had sharpened her precision to a razor's edge. The operators nearby were silent, awestruck, some shaking their heads as if trying to rationalize what they had just heard. She lowered the rifle carefully, slinging it over her shoulder. "The shot," she said softly, "wasn't about glory. It was about completion. Mission first. Everything else second." The chief felt a weight settle in his chest. She wasn't seeking recognition, medals, or validation. She had survived, accomplished what others deemed impossible, and carried it silently, like a scar invisible to the world. As dusk turned to night, the desert cooled, shadows merging into darkness. The operators packed up quietly, the mood subdued yet electrified. They understood instinctively that they had just glimpsed a rare and lethal precision, one that defied ordinary understanding. The chief remained, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her as she walked toward the range exit. Dust rose in her wake, shimmering in the fading light. Her presence lingered long after she left, like an echo in the desert. He finally spoke aloud, voice low, almost to himself. "She's not just a sniper. She's something else. And if we don't understand her history, we'll never understand what she's capable of." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken acknowledgement. She had revealed fragments of a life most couldn't imagine, a lethal skill few could comprehend, and a calm that unnerved even the SEAL chief. She disappeared into the shadows of the range, leaving operators whispering calculations, stories, and disbelief. But the chief stayed behind, leaning on the Humvee, thinking. This encounter was only the beginning. There was more to her than this desert range, more to the 3,600-meter shot, more to the experience that had forged her into something extraordinary. And he knew instinctively that unraveling her story would change everything he thought he knew about long-range sniping, skill, and survival. Night had settled over the Nevada range, a blanket of deep indigo stretching across jagged mountains and flat desert plains. The last hints of sunlight faded, leaving long shadows that blurred lines between the Humvees, targets, and the operators scattered around the range. The cool air carried a faint metallic scent, mixed with dust, sweat, and the faint tang of spent brass. The SEAL chief watched her move like a phantom, adjusting her gear, her silhouette poised, her rifle slung effortlessly over her shoulder. Even in darkness, she commanded attention without effort. The operators had begun winding down for the night, some chatting quietly, others inspecting their weapons. Yet almost all of them kept glancing at her, as though drawn by some invisible force. She didn't encourage it. She didn't flaunt her presence. She simply existed, moving with quiet efficiency, a lethal shadow that no one dared to interrupt. The chief leaned against the hood of a Humvee, studying her every movement, trying to piece together the layers of skill, experience, and survival instinct she carried. "You ever tell anyone?" he asked softly, voice low enough to be private, yet cutting through the quiet hum of the camp. Her dark eyes lifted briefly, meeting his gaze, unblinking, unreadable. "No," she said simply. Then she looked away, scanning the horizon as though checking invisible threats. "Not like this. Not anyone who doesn't need to know." The chief nodded, recognizing the honesty in her tone. She wasn't hiding out of fear. She was hiding because the world she operated in didn't care for nuance or truth. History was often written by those who wanted recognition, medals, or fame. She had none of those needs. She had survival, precision, and silence, and that was more dangerous than any notoriety could convey. "You said Cooner," he continued, leaning closer, lowering his voice even further. "Walk me through it. The target, the shot, the setup." She exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as she recalled distant mountains, the crunch of gravel under boots, the hush of the wind through valley ridges. We had intel limited, vague, and unverified. A commander moved between compounds unpredictably. No approach was safe. The terrain offered little cover, and time was never on our side. We weren't a sanctioned unit. We weren't on the maps. Every step was off the books, every move potentially lethal. The chief remained silent, absorbing each word. He had seen missions go sideways with fully sanctioned forces, with maps, air support, and intelligence. The fact that she had operated in this shadow realm, under circumstances where even the slightest miscalculation meant death, spoke volumes about her skill and mindset. "The ridge we used was unstable," she continued. "Elevation, wind, temperature, humidity all had to be calculated precisely. I had one chance, one round, and I couldn't afford error." One of the operators shifted, trying to mask his amazement. "One shot? That's insane." She didn't smile or acknowledge him. She simply adjusted the rifle again, demonstrating the fluid, almost imperceptible movements that allowed her to account for physics, gravity, and atmospheric conditions. "Necessary," she said quietly. "Not insane. Necessary." The chief studied her hands, the way her fingers traced the rifle, aligning it like it was an extension of her body. There was no hesitation, no overthinking, only instinct, honed by experience and repetition. He had trained some of the world's best snipers, yet she eclipsed them all. Every calculation, every pause, every exhale carried weight far beyond the desert range. She lowered the rifle briefly, looking at the scattered operators, noting the whispers and glances. "You won't understand unless you've been there," she said softly. "Unless you've calculated life and death in a single heartbeat, threaded a bullet through physics itself, felt the weight of one life in your hands, while knowing the next second could end yours." The chief nodded, silently acknowledging the truth. He understood. Only those who had faced similar impossible odds could even approach the concept. Most men couldn't imagine it, much less survive it. She had not only survived, it had shaped her, sharpened her, and made her lethal beyond measure. "Distance?" he asked carefully, almost reverently. She lifted her gaze, eyes distant as though recalling the exact moment. 3,600 meters, she said quietly. The desert seemed to still around them. 3,600 meters. A shot beyond what most men dared even to calculate. The chief's pulse quickened. He had studied ballistics, physics, and sniper theory. He knew the variables: Coriolis effect, wind drift, bullet velocity, temperature, elevation. He knew the mathematical impossibility. Yet here she was, confirming it had been done. And done without error. First round. Dead center. The operators nearby whispered calculations, heads shaking. Some were incredulous, others wide-eyed in silent reverence. None of them fully grasped the magnitude, yet instinct told them they were witnessing history in the making, or at least a shadow of it. She didn't elaborate, didn't narrate the glory. She only continued, methodically recounting the preparation. "I had to account for elevation changes, atmospheric density, wind gusts, and the movement of the target. One breath, one trigger squeeze. Timing was everything. The rest was confirmation." The chief felt the weight of her words sink into him. This wasn't skill measured in rounds fired at a range. This was survival, executed with lethal precision under circumstances most men wouldn't survive. He recognized it now. She didn't just hit a target. She threaded death through physics, probability, and instinct, and carried it without need for recognition. "You made it sound calm," he said quietly. "Like breathing." Her eyes flicked to him briefly, faint tension in her jaw. "Because it had to be," she replied softly. "Fear doesn't help. Hesitation kills. Calculation and instinct, those are what matter. Nothing else." The operators remained silent, captivated by her every word, every movement, every nuance. Even in the cool night, her presence was magnetic. She moved through the range like a shadow, lethal yet calm, carrying a history no one could fully comprehend. The chief stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And after the shot?" She tilted her head slightly, recalling the aftermath. Confirmation came quickly. One life ended. Mission complete. No one knew. No one needed to know. That was how it had to be. One shot, one mission, one outcome. A young operator whispered, awestruck, "You didn't miss?" "No," she said softly. "Not a single shot." The chief felt a mixture of awe and unease. He had seen extraordinary shooters before, but she carried her skill with a lethal calm that unsettled him. She wasn't performing. She wasn't seeking approval. She was a professional shaped by circumstances that left few survivors, wielding precision like a shadow in the night. As the operators packed up for the evening, the chief remained, leaning on the Humvee, absorbing every detail. He knew instinctively that she had carried more than skill. She had carried responsibility, danger, and life-or-death calculations in a world that recognized none of it. She walked past him, rifle slung over her shoulder, dust rising softly with each step. The operators watched in quiet awe, whispers trailing behind her like shadows. The chief exhaled slowly. He understood that this encounter was only the beginning. The 3,600-meter shot, the precision, the silent history, he would need to follow it to fully comprehend the woman behind the rifle. And as night fully settled over the Nevada desert, he realized the truth. She wasn't just a sniper. She was a ghost in plain sight, carrying a record of survival and precision that few could believe and fewer still could match. The desert night was absolute, a cold contrast to the blistering heat of the day. Stars spread across the sky in a brilliant scatter, pinpricks of light over the rugged Nevada range. Shadows from the mountains cut deep lines across the sand, creating natural corridors where imagination and reality intertwined. The SEAL chief leaned against a Humvee, arms crossed, watching her move silently across the range. She carried the Barrett .50 over her shoulder with ease, each step deliberate, each motion calibrated, as though the rifle and her body were fused into one lethal instrument. Around them, operators were winding down, some packing gear, others whispering quietly. But almost every pair of eyes drifted toward her, unable to resist the magnetic precision and calm she radiated. Even the youngest operators, fresh from months of grueling training, glanced in awe. They knew instinctively that she was different, that she had walked through fire most of them couldn't imagine. The chief observed silently, noting every subtle motion, the way her fingers flexed around the rifle, the slight tilt of her head when scanning the horizon, the measured rhythm of her breathing. He had trained some of the best snipers in the world, men who had faced death countless times, yet none of them moved with the absolute calm and precision she exhibited. This was mastery born of necessity and honed in silence. "Your training," he said finally, his voice low, breaking the quiet of the night. "Where did it come from?" Her eyes lifted briefly, dark and unreadable. "Everywhere," she said simply. She didn't elaborate, didn't give specifics. But the weight behind the word suggested years spent learning under conditions few could survive. Contractors, military units, black ops, shadow teams, whatever combination it was, she had lived it, and it had shaped her. "You've carried more than this rifle," the chief said, gesturing toward her gear and stance. "Experiences, battles. You're not just trained, you're refined by it." She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the compliment. She adjusted the scope, running her hands along the barrel as if recalibrating not just the rifle, but her own focus. "You don't get refinement without pressure," she said quietly. "Without necessity. Without consequences. One mistake and it's over. That's how you learn." The chief nodded slowly. He understood that kind of pressure, had seen men break under it, had watched careers end in a second. Yet she carried it all with silent efficiency, as though she had absorbed the lessons and left fear behind. The difference was unnerving and captivating all at once. The operators nearby were silent, straining to hear, trying to grasp fragments of her history. Some whispered among themselves, comparing notes, trying to imagine the kinds of missions she had undertaken. Ghost units, black ops, high-risk assignments with zero oversight, none of it was ever taught. All of it learned in the crucible of survival. "You calculate everything," the chief said, stepping closer. "Wind, elevation, distance, everything. But how do you handle the human factor? The stress? The stakes?" Her eyes flicked to him, sharp, as though measuring his understanding. "Stress is just data," she said. "You can't afford panic. You can't afford emotion to cloud calculation. You observe, adapt, execute. Life doesn't pause for hesitation. Death doesn't wait for doubt. You move through it. You survive it. That's the rule." He exhaled slowly, letting her words settle. It was more than skill. It was philosophy, mindset, survival instinct codified into action. He had seen plenty of shooters panic at the last moment, falter under pressure, or let ego compromise precision. She had none of those weaknesses. None. Every motion, every adjustment, every breath was deliberate, honed, lethal. She raised the Barrett again, scanning the desert horizon with the scope. Operators instinctively backed off, giving her space, reverence in the absence of recognition. The chief watched her eyes narrow, observing an invisible target only she could perceive. Her presence was a lesson in control, silent, methodical, and unstoppable. "You're not just a sniper," he said softly, almost to himself. "You're a shadow." A weapon forged in silence. She didn't respond, continuing to move through the motions, checking her gear, adjusting her stance, scanning. And yet, the chief noticed a subtle relaxation in her posture, a quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from mastery. She had faced impossible odds before, and she would again. Every movement was proof, every exhale a testament. The operators whispered among themselves, voices hushed in awe. "She's not human," one said quietly, shaking his head. "That shot 3,600 meters. First round." "Impossible." "Not impossible," the other replied. "Necessary." The word echoed her philosophy, almost as if they had understood more than she had spoken. The chief's thoughts drifted briefly to her Afghanistan operations, imagining the mountains, the hidden compounds, the unpredictable targets. The coordination, calculation, patience required. He had trained for years in controlled environments, yet she had done it under fire, under uncertainty, where one miscalculation meant death. And she had executed perfectly. "You've carried more than your rifle," he said again, voice low. "You carry experiences, precision, history, ghosts, maybe. That's what makes you different." Her gaze lifted, meeting his briefly, faint tension in her jaw. "Difference doesn't matter," she said. "Survival does. Mission does. Precision does. The rest is noise." The chief nodded, understanding the unspoken truth. Legends, accolades, recognition, they meant nothing to someone like her. Her world existed in split-second calculations, executed flawlessly, and carried in silence. He realized then that her reputation, her record, the impossible shot, wasn't for anyone's admiration. It was a necessity, carried like a burden, heavier than most men could bear. As the night deepened, the desert cooled, and shadows merged with darkness. She moved through the camp like a ghost, checking gear, scanning, adjusting, each step deliberate, silent, efficient. The operators had packed up, but their eyes followed her, drawn to the lethal calm that radiated from every motion. The chief remained, leaning against the Humvee, studying her. He realized instinctively that she had been trained for survival, refined by combat and honed by necessity. Every shot, every adjustment, every calculated breath was evidence of a life lived in extremes, where failure was never an option. She finally paused at the edge of the camp, rifle slung, dust rising softly with each step. For a brief moment, her eyes met the chief's. No words, no pride, just acknowledgement, quiet, lethal, and definitive. Then she disappeared into the shadows, leaving the operators whispering calculations and awe in her wake. The chief exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her presence and skill settle. She was more than a sniper. She was a shadow in plain sight, carrying a record of survival and precision that few could believe, fewer still could match. He understood instinctively that this encounter was only the beginning. There were layers of history, training, and lethal experience yet to uncover, and he intended to learn them all. Even as the desert night deepened, and stars glittered like distant beacons over the rugged range, the chief knew one truth. She had altered the rhythm of the camp, challenged the limits of belief, and rewritten what they thought possible for precision, calm, and deadly effectiveness. And he also knew that the story behind the 3,600-meter shot, the mission, the target, the preparation was far from over. It was only a fragment of a life lived on the razor's edge, and every detail she carried was a lesson in survival that would haunt him, inspire him, and drive him to understand everything she had endured. The desert morning broke with a pale golden light, washing over jagged Nevada ridges and the scattered range below. Dust shimmered in the first sunrays, catching on the edges of Humvees and scattered equipment. The operators were stirring, checking weapons and reviewing drills, yet their attention kept drifting to her. She had already moved to the top of a ridge, Barrett .50 in hand, a figure of calm in the stark, shifting light. The SEAL chief approached cautiously, sensing that today would push boundaries few could even conceive. "Show me," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the soft hum of morning activity. "Not the story. The execution. How you do it." She didn't respond verbally. Her eyes scanned the distant terrain, calculating in silence, reading invisible lines of trajectory and wind currents. Every subtle motion, from adjusting the scope to the faint tilt of her shoulders, was a language of precision the chief recognized instantly. Operators nearby instinctively stepped back, giving her space, yet their curiosity was palpable. Whispers floated. "She's going to do it again? 3,600 meters. Is that even possible?" "We're watching history." She placed the bipod carefully on the rocky surface, checking the stability, the angle of elevation, the natural vibration of the ridge. Her fingers traced along the rifle, adjusting the scope's windage and elevation knobs in a rhythm that was almost meditative. The chief watched, knowing instinctively that this was not performance. It was preparation honed through countless life and death encounters. "You measure everything," he said quietly. "Elevation, wind, distance. But what about instinct? The human factor?" Her eyes flicked to him briefly, unreadable, then returned to the target in the distance. "Instinct is everything. You calculate the variables. Yes, but instinct decides whether the shot survives chaos. Training gives precision. Instinct gives survival." The chief felt a shiver of recognition. He had trained men with extraordinary skill, yet instinct, the quiet, unteachable element, was often the difference between life and death. She had it in abundance, and it was deadly. She exhaled slowly, bringing her cheek to the stock, eyes narrowing through the scope. Operators held their breath, the desert silence amplifying the weight of the moment. Even the wind seemed to pause in reverence. The chief leaned against a nearby rock, aware that this was more than a demonstration. It was a glimpse into a realm of skill and precision that defied ordinary comprehension. "Distance?" he asked softly. She didn't answer immediately. She adjusted the scope slightly, noting subtle shifts in the light, calculating heat mirages, and tracking the faint, almost imperceptible movement of a distant target. 3,600 meters, she said quietly, almost as an afterthought. The operators exhaled slowly, disbelief written on every face. First round, dead center, 3,600 meters. The physics alone were staggering, yet here she stood, calm, precise, and resolute. She waited. Not impatiently, not nervously, just a quiet focus, measuring variables invisible to everyone else. The chief studied the ridge, the desert, the faint curve of the distant terrain, realizing that she wasn't just compensating for wind and gravity, she was anticipating life itself. Every movement of the target, every subtle atmospheric change, every pulse of motion had been accounted for instinctively, almost invisibly. The operators exchanged quiet glances. Some were skeptical, some in awe. The chief, however, remained silent, letting the moment settle. He knew he was witnessing a convergence of training, instinct, and experience that few in the world would ever see. Finally, she exhaled, a subtle, controlled release of breath, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the Barrett .50 echoed across the desert like distant thunder. Dust erupted downrange where the target had been positioned, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the subtle nods, the barely audible intake of breath, the exchanged glances confirmed the impossible. dead center. First round. The chief felt a mixture of awe and unease. He had trained men to execute under pressure, yet she had redefined pressure itself. The operators nearby were silent, some whispering in disbelief, others frozen, captivated. She lowered the rifle slowly, slinging it over her shoulder, and exhaled with a quiet tension release. "One shot," she said softly, almost casually. "Mission complete." The chief stepped closer, voice low, almost reverent. "Every variable calculated?" Her eyes met his briefly. "Every one," she said. Not a single margin of error ignored. Instinct guided the rest. He exhaled slowly, realizing that she carried not only skill, but a philosophy, a worldview in which precision, patience, and instinct converged to create lethal effectiveness. She wasn't performing for recognition. She was executing necessity. The operators began whispering quietly among themselves, some shaking their heads, others attempting to rationalize the impossible. "She didn't just hit the target," one said. "She threaded physics itself." The chief nodded. "Exactly," he murmured. "And she did it under conditions most men wouldn't survive. That's the difference." She adjusted the scope again, scanning the horizon as though checking for invisible threats, movements, or trajectories. Her presence was a lesson in control, calm, and lethal mastery. Operators instinctively gave her space, but their eyes lingered, studying every subtle adjustment, trying to learn what could not be taught in manuals or classrooms. "You carry more than skill," the chief said finally. "You carry experience, precision, history, and ghosts. That's what makes you different." Her gaze flicked to him, faint acknowledgement, and then she turned her attention back to the distant horizon. "Difference doesn't matter," she said softly. "Precision does. Mission does. Survival does. Everything else is noise." The chief exhaled, understanding the unspoken truth. Recognition, accolades, and medals meant nothing to her. She existed in a realm where life and death, calculation, and instinct were the only constants. Her history, her skill, and the weight of impossible decisions were her reality. As the morning sun climbed higher, the desert came alive with shadows stretching and shifting. She moved methodically through the range, checking her equipment, scanning, adjusting. The operators had finished drills, but many still watched, drawn to the lethal calm, the quiet mastery that defined her presence. The chief remained behind, leaning against a Humvee, contemplating the implications of what he had witnessed. This woman wasn't just a sniper. She was a shadow in plain sight, carrying a record of survival and precision that few could believe, fewer could replicate, and none could match. The 3,600-meter shot was more than a statistic. It was a demonstration of instinct, patience, and lethal calculation. It was proof of a life lived in extremes, where every moment carried consequences beyond imagination. And the chief knew instinctively that her story wasn't finished. There were chapters yet to be revealed, battles yet to be recounted, lessons yet to be learned. Even as the operators began to disperse, whispering in awe and disbelief, the chief watched her, realizing one truth. She had altered the perception of what was possible. The impossible had been executed flawlessly, silently, and without recognition. She had rewritten the boundaries of skill, patience, and survival in the desert light, leaving everyone who witnessed it humbled, inspired, and profoundly unsettled. And he knew, deep down, that understanding her story fully, the missions, the training, the experiences that had honed her precision to this level, would take time, patience, and careful observation. But one thing was certain. The SEAL chief would not rest until he understood the full measure of the woman behind the rifle, the shadow in plain sight, who had just redefined the limits of possibility. The sun had climbed high over the Nevada desert, scorching yet brilliant, painting jagged ridges and rocky outcrops in shades of gold and amber. The range had quieted, leaving only the distant hum of engines and the faint rustle of wind across the sand. The operators were packing up, checking gear, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. The story of the 3,600-meter shot, executed flawlessly, replayed in their minds like a legend too extraordinary to be true. The SEAL chief remained, leaning against a Humvee, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ridge where she had stood moments before. He felt a mix of awe, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing curiosity. He had seen elite snipers in combat, men decorated with valor and feats of skill, yet none carried the lethal precision and calm mastery she displayed. The impossible had been made possible, executed without hesitation, and yet the woman herself remained almost invisible in her humility. She moved silently among the operators, checking rifles, adjusting scopes, and ensuring every team member had completed their drills. Her presence demanded respect, but not in a way that sought attention. It was natural, effortless, and yet undeniably magnetic. The chief watched, understanding now that her mastery extended beyond marksmanship. It was in her very being, in the rhythm of her movements, the precision of her decisions, the weight of experience she carried silently. "You've done more than impress," he said finally, stepping closer. "You've changed how they think about possibility, about precision, about survival." Her dark eyes flicked to him, calm and unreadable. "That's not my concern," she said softly. "Mission first. Execution second. Everything else is noise." The chief nodded slowly, recognizing the philosophy. Ego, recognition, glory, none of it mattered to her. What mattered was calculation, instinct, and survival. The 3,600-meter shot had not been a feat for acclaim. It had been necessity, executed flawlessly. And that made it infinitely more terrifying, more inspiring, and more profound. The operators, now gathered in small clusters, exchanged hushed whispers. "Did you see that?" One said, eyes wide. 3,600 meters. First round. "I can't even calculate that," another replied. And she did it without hesitation. The chief studied their faces, noting the mixture of awe and disbelief. Some were struggling to comprehend the scale of her skill, while others instinctively recognized what they had witnessed. A living demonstration of precision, patience, and lethal instinct, refined through combat and shadow missions few would survive. She approached the ridge once more, resting the Barrett on her shoulder. Her gaze swept across the horizon, scanning, calculating, moving through invisible trajectories that only she could see. The chief stepped closer, voice low, almost a whisper. "You've carried more than rifles and rounds," he said. "You've carried experiences, ghosts, and impossible calculations. That's what makes you different." Her eyes met his briefly, acknowledging the truth without elaboration. "Difference doesn't matter," she said. "Precision does. Mission does. Survival does. The rest fades." The chief exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her presence settle. He understood now that the story of the 3,600-meter shot was only a fragment of her life, a glimpse into the disciplined, dangerous, and unparalleled mastery she embodied. Every motion, every calculation, every controlled breath was evidence of a life forged in extremes, where failure was never an option, and perfection was the only acceptable outcome. The operators watched silently, absorbing every detail. Some scribbled notes, trying to record the impossible. Others simply stared, overwhelmed by the precision, the calm, and the lethal authority she exuded. Whispers floated through the camp. "She's a ghost. A weapon forged in silence. I've never seen anything like it." The chief remained silent, reflecting on what he had witnessed. He had trained some of the most skilled operators in the world, yet none had left an impression like hers. The 3,600-meter shot was more than a demonstration of skill. It was a manifestation of survival, instinct, and necessity distilled into action. And she had carried it out without fanfare, without ego, and without acknowledgement beyond what the mission demanded. She walked slowly past the operators, dust rising softly with each step. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, precise. The chief followed her with his eyes, understanding instinctively that this woman, this shadow in plain sight, had already altered the perception of what was possible. Finally, she paused at the edge of the range, slinging the Barrett over her shoulder. For the briefest moment, her eyes met the chief's once more. No words passed between them, yet the unspoken acknowledgement carried weight. He had witnessed mastery, lethal instinct, and experience beyond imagination, and she had allowed him to see it. Then, as silently as she had arrived, she turned and walked into the desert, leaving operators whispering calculations, awe, and disbelief in her wake. The chief exhaled deeply, realizing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had rewritten the rules of precision, survival, and marksmanship in the span of a few hours. The 3,600-meter shot, executed flawlessly, was only a fragment of her story, a testament to the life she had led, the missions she had survived, and the mastery she had earned. He thought of Afghanistan, of Kunar province, of shadow missions, limited intel, and high-risk objectives. He imagined the invisible threads of calculation, instinct, and lethal decision-making she had woven across those mountains. And he understood now that every movement she made, every shot she fired, every calculated breath was a continuation of that legacy, silent, deadly, and unyielding. The operators began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, still processing the demonstration of impossible precision. Some tried to rationalize it, some simply accepted it as fact. But all of them carried the memory of her calm, her skill, and her lethal mastery. The chief remained, leaning on the Humvee, letting the desert wind brush against him. He realized that this encounter would stay with him, shaping his understanding of what human skill, instinct, and precision could achieve. She had shown them the impossible, and in doing so, had left a lasting impression that no one would forget. The desert was quiet again, the heat of the day beginning to rise. Dust swirled softly, sunlight glinting off distant ridges. And somewhere beyond the range, she disappeared into the horizon, leading operators, colleagues, and the SEAL chief with one undeniable truth. The impossible had been executed, and the woman who had achieved it would remain a legend, a shadow, a master of precision beyond comprehension. The chief finally spoke aloud, voice low and reflective. "She's not just a sniper," he said. "She's something else entirely. A shadow in the light. And if we ever hope to understand the full measure of skill, survival, and precision, we'll need to follow her story, piece by piece." Even as he spoke, the desert seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the truth. The 3,600-meter shot was more than a statistic. It was proof that mastery existed beyond ordinary understanding, in the hands of someone forged by necessity, tempered by survival, and defined by lethal instinct. And as the operators finally departed, leaving only the hum of vehicles and the whisper of wind across the sand, the SEAL chief remained, contemplating the woman who had just altered their understanding of skill, precision, and what it meant to survive and excel beyond any conceivable limit. Her story, her legacy, and the impossible shot would linger in the minds of all who had witnessed it. A shadow of perfection, a record of survival, and a legend of lethal mastery that would endure far beyond the desert range.